Outside his civil fraud trial today, Donald Trump signaled with a "my lips are sealed" gesture, but once he took the witness stand, he was anything but silent.
Inside that courtroom, with Donald Trump really pushing and pushing and pushing the judge.
Trump appeared ready for a confrontation as he stared directly into the cameras. From the moment he took the witness stand, he repeatedly clashed with Judge Arthur Engoron, responding with lengthy statements instead of giving simple yes or no answers. "This is a very, very unfair trial," Trump complained. The judge then turned to Trump's legal team and warned, "Control your client. If you can't, I will." He also sharply interrupted attorney Alina Habba, instructing her to sit down after she argued that Trump should be allowed to continue his extended responses. Habba later pushed back against the judge's handling of the exchange outside the courthouse.
I was told to sit down today. I was yelled at, and I've had a judge who is unhinged slamming a table. Let me be very clear. I don't tolerate that in my life. I'm not going to tolerate it here.
Take another look at his hands in that moment. Notice how motionless they remain while he continues talking without pause. That isn't the body language of confidence. It looks more like someone slipping back into a role he has played for decades. Except this time, the room is no longer applauding. What no one openly said inside that courtroom was something nearly every attorney there already understood. Donald Trump was not fighting for his freedom that day. He couldn't have been. That battle had effectively been decided months earlier in a written ruling by the very judge he was now confronting. So what was he really fighting for? Stay with me, because the answer may be even more unsettling than defeat itself. He was battling in front of an audience that no longer had the power to change the outcome, and somewhere in that courtroom, perhaps for the first time in half a century, Donald Trump appeared to sense that the walls were finally beginning to close in around him.
Things got so heated that less than an hour in, the judge called for a 15-minute recess in an attempt to cool things down. But when Trump came back, his attitude was unchanged. He called the attorney general a fraud and the entire trial a political witch hunt.
Because it's a scam.
When he was done testifying, he declared the day a win for him.
You saw what I had to say today, and it was very conclusive. Everything we did was absolutely right.
He may feel emboldened by bombshell new polls that show him beating President Biden in 2024.
When the court reconvened after the recess, Trump returned unchanged. His tone was the same, his volume was the same, and he continued making the same accusations, refusing to acknowledge that the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Calling the attorney general a fraud and dismissing the entire case as a scam was presented not as a legal argument, but as evidence that he still believed forceful rhetoric could alter reality. He proclaimed the day a victory even as the judge continued building a record that could ultimately result in hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties. Consider how the events unfolded. He was interrupted by the court. The proceedings paused because of his conduct. When the hearing resumed, he intensified his approach rather than backing away. Then, after leaving the courthouse, he publicly declared that he had won. According to this interpretation, each of those actions was aimed at an audience outside the courtroom, one that could cheer him on, but had no power to influence the legal consequences unfolding inside. Every additional statement Trump placed on the record carried potential weight, and the cost of those moments, the narrator argues, could prove to be extraordinarily high. Trump and his children have continued to deny any wrongdoing, and while
Trump and his children have denied any wrongdoing, and while Trump just took the stand about an hour ago, the judge has already accused the former president of treating this appearance like a political rally. The judge has urged Trump's lawyers a number of times to control their client. Let's go right to NBC's Vaughn Hilliard outside the courthouse. Vaughn.
Hey, good morning, Jose. Donald Trump just leaving here the courtroom for a morning break after a contentious first 90 minutes of Donald Trump on the stand and under oath, facing questions from the New York Attorney General's prosecution. But for Donald Trump, much of this was included interjections from the judge, Judge Engoron, who already has fined him twice for violating a gag order for attacking a member of his staff. But for this instance of Donald Trump on the stand, it was condemnation for the judge for giving, in his words, a political rally and speeches and not answering the actual questions from the New York Attorney General's prosecutor. At one point, the judge ordered Donald Trump's own attorney, Chris Kise, and Alina Habba to sit down after both were making the case that Donald Trump is free to answer the questions as he sees fit, that this is, in their words, an unusual circumstance to have the former president of the United States and, in the words of Chris Kise, the future president of the United States on the stand answering questions under oath, and that he should be able to build the narrative that he sees fit. Donald Trump on the stand called this an unfair trial and suggested that he was being politically targeted, which again was met with condemnation by the judge, who at multiple times had suggested that Chris Kise, his attorney, should pull his client aside and talk with him because he needed to answer the questions put forward by the New York Attorney General's office.
This was the point where the image began to crack. It wasn't when Trump raised his voice or insisted the trial was unfair. According to this interpretation, the turning point came when the judge ordered his own attorneys to sit down, treating them like disruptive participants in the courtroom. Chris Kise and Alina Habba, the lawyers responsible for defending him, were left with little room to respond as the judge openly overruled them in front of everyone present. Each time Trump spoke at length instead of following the court's direction, his legal team found itself under increasing pressure. The judge responded without hesitation, repeatedly cutting off their attempts to intervene. What unfolded, the narrator argues, was no longer a carefully managed legal defense, but a public display of a strategy coming apart. The man who once expected unwavering loyalty now appeared unable to keep even his own attorneys in a position to defend him effectively. In this telling, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The court was no longer intimidated by Trump, while his legal team appeared to be operating under mounting pressure. According to the narrator, that change altered the dynamics of the case in a significant way.
Yesterday, the defense team's own witness, a former Trump Organization executive named Jeffrey McConney, who is a co-defendant in the case, may have provided a direct link between the ex-president and the alleged exaggerations of the value of his properties. According to Business Insider, quote, McConney had been called to the witness stand by the defense, but on cross-examination by lawyers for the state attorney general's office Tuesday, he linked Trump firmly to the conspiracy and fraud counts that have yet to be decided in the non-jury trial. McConney was handed People's Exhibit 3054, a draft of Trump's net worth statement for 2014. He was asked to look at a note scribbled in thin blue ink on the draft's first page, DJT, to get final review, which he said he had written. The AG has alleged the net worth statement that McConney was handed the draft for from 2014 contained $3.5 billion in exaggerations. McConney also broke down in tears on the witness stand, saying that the mounting legal investigations led him to retire from the job after 35 years.
This is the moment the narrator argues should concern even Trump's most loyal supporters. According to this account, the most damaging evidence did not come from the attorney general or the prosecution. It came from within Trump's own business organization. A longtime employee who had worked for Trump for 35 years and who was also a co-defendant in the case took the witness stand. Rather than shielding Trump, he presented the court with a handwritten note stating DJT to get final review. During his testimony, he reportedly became emotional and broke down in tears. According to the narrator, the same system of loyalty that Trump spent decades building ultimately produced the document that allegedly connected him directly to billions of dollars in inflated property valuations. While that witness was giving emotional testimony under oath, Trump was outside the courthouse publicly declaring victory. The narrator argues that, at that point, there was little room left to reshape the public narrative. When individuals from within your own organization begin providing evidence and making emotional statements on the record, the situation changes fundamentally. In this telling, the collapse is no longer a future possibility. It has already begun, documented and signed by the very people who once stood closest to him.
Joining our conversation, New York Times investigative reporter Suzanne Craig is back, and with me at the table, MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin and New York Times editorial board member Mara Gay. Susan, how did Jeffrey McConney's testimony read to you?
I mean, it wasn't great. I think in a trial of not a lot of great days for Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. You know, there's a document that's out there. It's as you mentioned, the 2014 statements of financial condition, and right on the top of it, it says DJT to get final review, and it really does tie Trump to the document. We don't know if he got final review, but it shows there was some sort of acknowledgement in the organization that Donald Trump would sign off on these documents. And you know, Donald Trump has really tried to distance himself from this. He has said that he has an army of accountants and lawyers who look at these things. And I always think it's interesting with the Trump Organization, you hear on the one hand, they're a mom and pop organization, very tightly run, you know, from the top down to the point where Donald Trump, up until the time he went to the White House, was signing every check that went out the door. But then you have, when it suits them, they're a large organization and they really don't get into the minutia of things like statements of financial conditions and audits. They rely on others. And the testimony from, I think, Jeff McConney yesterday really did tie the president, at least in some way, the former president in some way, to the financial statements. And that, you know, is significant.
Well, I want to ask you, Lisa, about that. According to Business Insider, the spreadsheet czar had testified on direct examination Monday that he would review each year's draft net worth statement with former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg, who would then give the approved draft to the outside accounting firm Mazars USA, which would print the final statement. Quote, I believe there was a step in between that involved Donald Trump prior to 2017, state lawyer Andrews said to McConney, who appeared uncomfortable on the stand as he said Trump indeed did the ultimate signing off. McConney's many handwritten notes indicate it was Trump and his top executives who made the last edits and then signed off on these net worth statements. As such, the notes do serious damage to the primary Trump defense. Blame Mazars, blame the accountants. Is this a direct link?
I think it is a direct link, but you don't even need this document, McConney's testimony, to get the direct link, because Donald Trump himself gave it to us on November 6th. He was on the stand with Andrew Raymer, who also did the examination yesterday, and he said, is it correct that you had reviewed the statements of financial condition in each of the years from 2011 to 2017 before it became final? And Donald Trump's answer, and I'm reading to you from the transcript, Alicia, is, yeah, I would look at them. So you had it from the horse's mouth. You didn't need Jeff McConney and his handwriting and the Attorney General confronting him with things that put sort of a wrench in the narrative about blame it on Mazars. Donald Trump was willing to admit it himself when he took the stand.
And yet, when we talk about Trump's legal team and the choices that they make, it is noteworthy that they chose, this was their witness. This was their witness who then added, perhaps they did not need it, but added more data points to suggest that Donald Trump indeed knew what he was doing.
Well, one of the other interesting things about the Trump Organization, and this was true in the White House as well, is that we know that Donald Trump chose people around him who were sometimes competent but always loyal. And so, you know, what we're seeing here is that even with a bevy of lawyers whose sole purpose was to protect Donald Trump, whether or not something illegal was going on, there were mistakes made. And in a way, the more cooks you have in a shop, the more complicated that becomes. So the very people who he hired thinking they're going to protect me, they're going to prevent me from putting my own name at risk, actually now may have kind of sealed his fate. And so I do think it makes a difference, at least to the public, to see, you know, Donald Trump to get final approval on this. I mean, it's true. We've heard it out of his mouth. We've seen it. There's a trail there. But there's something that feels different about putting it in writing, because Donald Trump is known for never putting anything in writing. And here it is, plain as day at the top of the document.
Sometimes competent, always loyal definitely belongs on a mug or on a T-shirt. Susan, I want to read this to you, too, from Business Insider. Quote, in one key cautionary note from the 2015 draft, McConney made a notation in ink that this computation also includes forecasted deals that have not signed yet.
According to the narrator, even people Trump had personally chosen were now presenting evidence that could be used against him. More significantly, the narrator argues that Trump had already made an important admission during his own testimony. "Yeah, I will look at them," he said from the witness stand. The narrator contends that throughout his career, Trump often shifted responsibility to accountants, attorneys, and other advisors rather than accepting it himself. Now, however, the combination of his own courtroom statements and documents produced by longtime members of his organization was, in the narrator's view, strengthening the case against him. The same individuals who had once been trusted for their unwavering loyalty were now appearing as reluctant witnesses whose testimony could have serious legal consequences.
No more just admonishments, no more sternly worded finger wagging, but when he's talking about, if this continues, the judge said, according to our reporters there, then I will strike the testimony and draw a negative inference. That means I will assume that your testimony, Donald Trump, would have been as harmful as can be to you. And so that's sort of the real weapon that the judge has here. He's warned of it, but that's his ultimate answer if this gets truly out of hand.
And Karen, again, clearly this was a strategy going in. I mean, for all the talk about remaining calm and doing things, you know, Trump went in there today, it seems, to blow things up to an extent, or to poke the bear as much as he possibly could, the bear being the judge. And that may be what he wants to do. But as Ellie points out, this is going to get very expensive for him. And I'm not talking about contempt fines. The finding by this judge could be as much as $250 million. And if he takes as much of a negative inference as he wants or can from Trump's testimony, it's expensive testimony.
According to the narrator, what the public was witnessing was more than a defense strategy struggling under pressure. It was the implosion of a system built on control, loyalty, and denial, one that was ultimately buckling under the weight of its own records and testimony. In this telling, there was no longer anyone inside the organization able to shield him from the consequences. This marks the end of the performance, not the end of the trial, but the end of the belief that Donald Trump can still dominate every room he enters. Over the course of more than an hour, we watched a man who, according to this account, repeatedly made decisions that only increased the consequences he could ultimately face. He was no longer trying to prove his innocence. That issue had already been addressed months earlier in a written ruling finding that he had systematically overstated the value of his assets by billions of dollars. The only major question left before the court was the size of the financial penalty. Yet throughout his testimony, Trump appeared to make choices that, according to the narrator, could increase that final amount. Eventually, the judge moved beyond simple warnings and relied on a more significant legal principle: negative inference. In straightforward terms, this means that if a witness refuses to answer a direct question under oath, the court may conclude that a truthful answer would have been unfavorable to that witness. Every time Trump responded with lengthy speeches instead of direct yes or no answers, the narrator argues, he gave the judge additional grounds to draw that inference. This was not presented as a procedural technicality, but as a factor that could contribute to a substantially larger financial judgment. Reports suggested the potential penalty could reach as high as $250 million, yet Trump continued speaking at length. The pattern throughout the morning remained remarkably consistent. He arrived outside the courthouse making the familiar sealed lips gesture for the cameras. Once inside, he returned to an approach that had served him for decades. In boardrooms, on television, and at political rallies. Raise the volume, repeat the grievance, accuse others of wrongdoing, declare victory regardless of the circumstances. But this courtroom operated by different rules. It responded to evidence, legal procedure, and judicial authority, not applause. When the judge instructed Trump's attorneys to control their client, and they were unable to assure the court that they could, the narrator argues that a clear impression was left behind. This defendant did not believe the rules applied equally to him. According to this interpretation, that impression could become part of the court's overall assessment when determining the final financial judgment. Perhaps the most revealing detail was not the shouting itself, but the body language. Watch the footage again. While Trump's words came rapidly, his hands often remained unusually still. The narrator interprets this not as the posture of someone fully in command, but of someone repeating a familiar performance that had become second nature. even though the audience was no longer responding as expected. He appeared to be projecting dominance in an environment specifically structured to prevent personal influence from overriding legal process. In that setting, the narrator argues, the result was not greater authority, but additional statements that the court could place into the official record. His legal team also found itself caught in the fallout. Chris Keese and Alina Habba were instructed to sit down in open court after they proved unable to stop Trump from turning portions of the proceeding into extended public arguments. According to the narrator, a former president watched his own attorneys be publicly reprimanded because of his conduct. Rather than demonstrating loyalty under pressure, the moment reflected what the narrator describes as a complete loss of control. An organization once known for strict top-down discipline could no longer prevent its central figure from undermining the only process that truly mattered. Then came what the narrator portrays as the internal turning point. A longtime Trump Organization executive, called by the defense itself, presented a handwritten note reading, DJT to get final review. During his testimony, the witness became emotional and broke down in tears. According to the narrator, later testimony confirmed what the document appeared to suggest, that Trump had personally reviewed the financial statements containing the disputed valuations. Trump had also previously acknowledged under oath, saying, "Yeah, I will look at them." As a result, the long-standing defense that accountants and attorneys handled the details while he remained removed from the process was, in the narrator's view, seriously undermined by both his own testimony and records produced by trusted employees. The loyalty he valued above all else ultimately became the mechanism that exposed him. All of this unfolded on the same day reports emerged of a bomb threat targeting Judge Arthur Engoron's home. Despite that, the judge appeared in court, took the bench, enforced courtroom procedure, and continued issuing the rulings and warnings that could influence the final financial outcome. The narrator presents the contrast as striking. One man faced a threat against his private residence while carrying out his judicial duties and still proceeded with the case. The other, confronting only the legal consequences of his own earlier actions, continued making statements that, according to the narrator, may have worsened his position. What unfolded was not portrayed as a carefully executed legal strategy. Instead, it was described as the collision between a lifelong pattern of behavior and a courtroom unwilling to operate according to that pattern. For decades, Trump influenced outcomes by controlling the setting around him. He owned the buildings, set the terms, and shaped the environment in which events unfolded. He was the employer, so he set the expectations. He was the central figure, so he was used to deciding how the story ended. A courtroom reverses every one of those dynamics. The judge controls the proceedings. The evidentiary record shapes the narrative. Speeches are not evidence. Refusing to answer direct questions can lead to negative inferences, and the consequences are measured in financial penalties, not public applause. Trump approached the penalty phase as though it were another negotiation he could win through force of personality. He labeled the Attorney General a fraud. He called the trial a scam. He declared the day a victory. But every one of those remarks was directed at an audience with no authority to reduce the judgment by a single dollar. The only audience with the power to determine the final amount was the judge, who, according to the narrator, was steadily building a record that reflected obstruction and what the court could interpret as consciousness of guilt. The deeper consequence, the narrator argues, extends beyond money. It is the public collapse of a long-standing image. That image portrayed Trump as someone who became stronger under pressure, thrived in confrontation, and could force institutions to bend simply by refusing to back down. What unfolded in the courtroom suggested the opposite. When the institution refused to yield, the narrator contends that Trump had no alternative approach. He continued repeating the same strategy, even as it appeared to work against his own interests in real time. Supporters may describe that conduct as determination or fighting spirit. They may argue that he refused to be silenced. But the narrator points to what he sees as a basic reality. Liability had already been established, and every additional statement had the potential to increase the financial consequences. Continuing to fight a battle that had effectively already been decided, in a courtroom that rewards precision and restraint rather than volume, is presented not as courage but as self-inflicted damage. By the close of the day, the judge had been presented with what the narrator describes as a complete record: a defendant who repeatedly avoided direct answers, attorneys who were unable to control their client, testimony filled with speeches instead of straightforward responses, and a consistent pattern of treating the proceeding more like a political rally than a legal process carrying serious financial consequences. Negative inference, the narrator argues, was no longer merely a warning. It had become a legal tool available to the court, and Trump's own conduct throughout the hearing only strengthened its potential application. This, according to the narrator, is what a public collapse can look like under oath. It does not always happen through one dramatic moment. Sometimes it unfolds through a series of decisions that steadily worsen the outcome, while the person making those decisions continues to insist everything is going their way. Trump left the courthouse saying the day had been a success and maintaining that everything he had done was entirely justified. The official record, the narrator argues, tells a different story. It reflects a man who had spent decades resisting limits, finally encountering a setting where those limits were consistently enforced, and whose response was simply to speak even more. The walls did not merely close around him, the narrator concludes. His own actions helped move them into place. Every extended speech, every refusal to answer directly, and every effort to transform the witness stand into a political stage added to the record the court would ultimately evaluate. When the final judgment is calculated, the narrator argues, it may also reflect the consequences of every unnecessary word spoken along the way. That is the story the cameras captured. Not a fighter refusing to surrender, but a performer continuing the same routine long after the audience that mattered had shifted its attention to the evidence. The legend depended on a room that would eventually give in. This courtroom never did. And according to the narrator, for the first time in half a century, Donald Trump found himself without another script to follow. If you saw these events the same way, leave a comment below and tell me which moment stood out the most to you. And if you'd like to follow future developments in this story, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update.